Chroma versus saturation. What are they? Which should you be using? I think it's time for a little color theory. Welcome to SETI Astro. In the video, I made some interactive tools for everybody to use. I'll have a link in the description below so you can download them and play with this stuff yourself. So this is, I think, an area where we just have a lot of questions. Like, we're processing our images, we open up curves or the equivalent in other editing software, and we bump up the saturation or the vibrance or whatever, and it looks richer, but you know, what are we doing? And I think a lot of people haven't really looked into what's really going on. Like, specifically in PixInsight, there's chroma or saturation, and I think a lot of people just raise the saturation in curves because it's a term they're familiar with, and that C may not be one that they're familiar with. And specifically what I'm talking about, I think most people just know this S as saturation, and they grab it and they bump it up and they hit apply, and then it looks, you know, more saturated. And that's what they're familiar with. The other thing they may see is this. It's literally called color saturation, right? And you could bump up. This will, you know, make the blues more blue, right? While kind of holding the reds where they were. And now the blues went up. But what is this? What are we doing here? Is there one that I think is better than the other when we're dealing with AstroImagers? So let's jump into it and try to tease this all apart. And I think the Munsell website itself says it best from the CIE. Saturation is the colorfulness of an area judged in proportion to its brightness. And then chroma is the colorfulness of an area judged as proportion of the brightness of the similarly illuminated area that appears white or highly transmitting. I hope that cleared it up for everybody. Please comment, like, and subscribe. No, that means nothing to nobody. So let's really see what this means and get into it. We're going to start with a chart like this. We're going to talk about saturation and chroma and how they change. So from the bottom to the top is lightness or luminosity. It's going to start dark at the bottom and go brighter and brighter and brighter, closer to white at the top. Chroma goes left to right, where you could think of it as just the intensity of color gets stronger as you go left to right. Saturation is the radial rays, the radial lines that come from the origin outwards. And the shallower the angle here, the higher the saturation is going to be. So when you're raising the saturation in your image, you could think of taking one of these lines and curving it down to the right. So if you had a spot that was up here, it's going to move here and then here. You could see what that's doing. Not only is it bringing up the level or the richness of the color, it's bringing down the actual lightness of it. Whereas if you raise the chroma using that C button here, this raises the chroma. What that does is it moves the whole line just to the right. So it's going to maintain, if you were here, let's say, and you're going to raise it to the right, it's just going to move it along the same value of brightness to the right. Now we could actually see that in action in this image. So I'm just going to make a clone of this image. And in the clone, I'm going to convert the clone to grayscale. Now it's going to show us something really cool when we do that. All I did was convert it to grayscale. And now you can see each row here is the same brightness level. So theoretically, when you raise the chroma, not only are you making it more colorful, but you're maintaining the luminosity at that spot. And for Astro images, this is where I prefer chroma over saturation because it doesn't mess with your luminance channel at all. It maintains the luminosity of your image as you're getting those richer colors. There is a point right when you start clipping, we can get into that, how that's going to change things. Saturation, on the other hand, is great if you want to quickly get richer colors, but you're less concerned about the actual luminosity of it. So if you are going to, let's say, boost the colors in your RGB image, and you want to make them nice and intense, deep and dark with your colors, because right, the higher the saturation goes, the darker the value is going to get. And then you're going to merge luminosity in with it later. That's a viable thing to do, right? Because you're going to bring that brightness back by adding the luminosity back in. So you're less concerned about saturation. Here's another example. This one's from sensationalcolor.com. But if we go ahead and make another clone of this one, so now we got an image from high chroma to low chroma, and you can see it's like a grayer color. High saturation to low saturation, and then the intensities on the bottom. And again, if we go ahead and convert the image to grayscale, you're going to see that the top, even though the color itself changes across it, the intensity, like if you converted that whole top to grayscale, it's just one solid grayness, if you will. So that's really, this should really drive home the point of what chroma does. It makes the color richer, but maintains the luminosity in the image. So as a default, I use chroma, right? You're not messing with the luminosity at all. I think a lot of people are just more familiar with the term saturation, and that's what they prefer to use. And from a more practical perspective, when you're raising the chrominance, you're converting the RGB values on the screen and turning them into something called lab color, where this is a direct measure of color. It's not subjective like the RGB on the screen. We could talk about a lot of this as well, but for our purposes, it's broken into the L, which is the lightness component, and then A star and B star. You'll find A star and B star also in Curves Transform if you're using that tool. And you'll know the one, if you raise or lower, it makes it more red or green, and then the other one makes it more blue or yellow. So that's where all your color data lives. So when you're increasing the chrominance, all you're doing is multiplying the A star and B star by some amount. So if it was already negative, it's going to make a little more negative. If it was already positive, it's going to make a little more positive. And that's going to amplify the color data in there. The L itself never changes. So that is why, theoretically, changing the chrominance won't change the luminance at all. It's because it doesn't move it at all. So here's the little program I made. Again, the links will be in the description below so you can download it. What this is going to show is the original image here, adjusting the saturation and adjusting the chroma. I have just two kind of sample images. One was just like a solid muted color, and then another chunk of the Andromeda galaxy here. And you can click in the main original image here, and it's going to give you the RGB values at that particular point. So let's go ahead and look at a value like this. So we have RGB values here. I just also put the average brightness down for each one of them. And then for saturation, let's just go ahead and click like a 1.5. And you can see the saturation here in the middle is much more intense, and how the RGB values changed. The red is still about the same, and the G and the B's came down. What it's doing is removing some of the white component and scaling it. So because of that, necessarily it gets a little darker. On the Chroma, on the other hand, if we go ahead and bump that up, now we got additional color here as well, and the average brightness stayed the same. You'll see the red came up some, the green kind of stayed the same, and the blue dropped a little bit. So it's intensifying the color without adjusting the actual brightness of that particular pixel, right? And we can go around and check other pixels. Here's a case where the reds were already strong. And again, the red on the saturation doesn't change. It's just removing some of that white component and scaling it. And because of that, now the G and B are much lower, and the average brightness is much further down at a 0.67. Whereas for the Chroma increase, the reds went up, the greens about stayed the same, and the blue dropped down. In this case, we can't go above 1. It's clipped at 1, and we did have a slight drop in average brightness. That's why RGB isn't considered a direct measure of color. Converting from these various spaces from lab or HSV or any of these other ones into RGB, you could have cases where the brightness could go above 1 or below 0. So you can't have negative brightness in a pixel. You can't also have brighter than the brightest value in a pixel. It's just how these color spaces work. But this particular little tool allows you to play around with some of these. So you can go ahead and just click any of these points and adjust the sliders down here how you want. Something I find interesting now, if we bring the saturation down, let's say you want to remove the dark, you want to remove the color in the background of your image, right? A lot of the time we'll mask out the object itself, so we're only affecting the background, and we'll lower the saturation to get rid of color modeling or things like that. You really want to be using Chroma for that too. So let's go ahead and just drop the saturation way down on both of them here. So now in this case, maybe I'll zoom in closer. Okay, hopefully you can see a little bit better. You can see that when you just drop the saturation out the bottom, you do get a grayscale image. But you could see that it's highly clipped, both high and low. So the values in here are all roughly uniform. They're all kind of the same brightness. Whereas on the Chroma side of the house, it retains the lightness, right? Because the Chroma with no saturation is the luminance. That's how you get the luminance. So removing or desaturating it with Chroma, you're really just showing the luminance in that background versus actually doing some kind of a desaturation with the HSV values in the saturation slider. So just other, some other things to think about when you're going around and playing with some of these values. So here I'm clicking way in the darkest point of this particular image, and at this point, they're all roughly going to kind of be the same, but you can see that desaturating it leads to a brighter value. And it's kind of the contrast of what we were talking about earlier, where increasing saturation, you got actually a lower intensity. Desaturating brightens it. So again, it just has to do with what you want for your image and what you're going to be doing with it. For me, again, I stick with Chroma for all these reasons. And I think it's just not used because people aren't familiar with the term. But you can go ahead and click on the other kind of muted color. It's RGB. It has a weight of 0.8, 0.6, and 0.4 for RG and B. And then again, you can play with the sliders and just kind of see how it's going to change the items, right? So again, for increasing saturation, you can see the red is stationary as the G and B start dropping. And then on the Chroma side of the house, you'll see A go up as B and G kind of start dipping down. So it really is a matter of, you know, what you want to see in your image. And then when we really make it even stronger, now we're running into a case where we're not converting correctly from lab color spaced RGB. We're starting to get some internal clipping. So you do see the brightness start dropping a little, 0.55 versus the actual 0.6 it's supposed to be. But again, as you increase the chroma, it's going to affect all the channels versus just stripping the white chunk and rescaling like saturation does. As you get a kind of a darker and darker image here as we increase the saturation on this particular image. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff. So quick summary. Again, this tool is available to download. Links in the description. So again, quick summary. Theoretically, ideally, changing chroma will change the richness of your colors, but not touch your luminosity at all. As you can see on the rows here, a luminosity of 5 on this row here, even though the color is getting richer. When we switch to grayscale, there's no change in the brightness value of it at all. Whereas for saturation, you're tilting this line as you get more and more saturated. Yes, the colors get deeper and deeper and deeper, but your brightness at that pixel value actually goes down and down and down. I mean, there's a trade-off. You can only get so saturated if you're so bright on the chroma scale, right? If you're really up at a 9 and you try to make that more saturated, more rich in color, there's only so far to the right it can go. So there are some benefits to both, and especially if you are taking your RGB image and using saturation to really bump up the colors and then incorporating your luminosity, that's a fine method. If you're manipulating your image to do those final color tweaks, maybe you want to neutralize an area, you know, kind of make it really color neutral, or you're playing with colors after you've already combined all your data together, you're really going to want to stick with adjusting chroma in your images. This video may have raised more questions than it answered. So maybe I can make a follow-up depending on what questions there were in the comments. But I hope this helps some people out there. Please comment, like, and subscribe.